You're listening to Shifting Schools, episode 239. Welcome back to another Shifting Schools podcast. I hope this finds you safe and healthy. I'm all by myself today, but don't worry, the amazing Trisha Friedman will be back with us next week. Today, however, I have a great chat with Francisco, who is the Director of Creative Learning at the Scratch Foundation. I have loved Scratch for years. If you don't know what I'm talking about the online program that teaches students to code through the game Scratch. It used to be a free game that was produced, and then it got open sourced and moved over to MIT. You can now find it at scratch.mit.org. I have been using Scratch with my kids, as far back as 2010, 11, something like that. Such a great way to get kids involved in learning how to design, the idea of design thinking, design-based learning environments. It's just an incredible tool. I'm sure you educators who are listening to this, you know all about Scratch, and it might be something that you've forgotten. And after today's episode, you're going to want to head back over to scratch.mit.org to look at some of the new resources they have. And again, we're talking with Francisco, who is the Director of Creative Learning at the Scratch Foundation. And he also helped to create the Scratch Ed Creative Computing Curriculum Guide, which you can find a link to that in our show notes. It's a curriculum guide to get you started. We talk about that today on the podcast as well. We also talk about this idea of some of the research that Francisco has done in design-based learning environments. So you're going to want to be listening for some of that research that he goes into around how this truly impacts student learning and impacts some of the things that we want students to be engaged in inside of our classrooms. And the last thing I want you to be listening for today is we get into a great discussion on the balance between structure and agency in the learning classroom. Many of you longtime listeners know that Trisha and I continually go on and on about creating structures for kids, and at the same time, making sure that we are giving students agency in their learning. Francisco and I get into a great conversation about trying to balance that idea of structure and agency, and how using a program like Scratch and the Creative Computing Curriculum Guide created by Scratch Ed, how that helps to impact that balance between structure and agency in our classroom. So just a great conversation. It's such an honor for me to get to actually talk to somebody involved directly with Scratch. And I know many of you out there are going to really like this episode as well. Before I get to today's episode, of course, just a quick shout out to today's show sponsor. That is Quizalize.com. You've been hearing a lot about them. If you've been following us here at Shifting Schools, we are so honored and appreciative of Quizalize.com to be a sponsor of everything we do here at Shifting Schools. Please do go over and visit them. Have a look. You can sign up for a free account. And remember, you can get 1 month free of their premium subscription when you sign up for your free account. So you have to go over there, sign up for your free teacher account, and then you want to visit bit.ly/shifting schools, all caps. So that's bit.ly/shifting schools, all one word, all caps. And when you do that, you'll get 1 month free of their premium subscription. And I know after you try that month of their premium subscription, you are going to want to buy their yearly subscription as well. So a big shout out to Quizalize.com. Please do head over there, visit the sponsors. That's what allows us to continue to make these great podcast episodes and all of the free guides and webinars and everything else we do at Shifting Schools. I also wanted to remind you, this is a great time of year that if you are a podcast listener, to maybe pause and give a little appreciation to all the podcasts that you listen to by giving us ratings and reviews either on podchaser.com or over on Apple iTunes podcast. Always a great way to, whatever podcast you listen to, go give them a rating, leave them a review. It's such a great way to honor your podcast. It takes a little bit of your time and we all really appreciate it. So I just wanted to have that shout out to, not just for this podcast, but for all podcasts you listen to. It's a great time of year just to be giving back through a quick little rating and review over there on Apple iTunes. I'm excited for you to hear about this. I really enjoy geeking out. You're going to hear some stories of my teaching years, of the ways that I use Scratch to engage kids in different ways. Such a great conversation. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Francisco, the Director of Creative Learning at the Scratch Foundation. And with that, on with the show. All right. I'm so excited to be here with Francisco, who is part of the Scratch Foundation team over at MIT, Director of Creative Learning. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I can only imagine what a day-to-day life of you looks like. But as we get into this, can we start off with just telling us how you initially became interested in computer science and how that passion has led you to a position at Scratch Foundation?
Sure. So I initially became interested in computers at an early age, and I think in different dimensions. One example that comes to mind is that I just grew up playing video games at home. That's one of the first computers. My dad actually also invested in an Apple II back in the day, and so. But I think it just opened up to my eyes to the different layers of how things are made, the roles of computing. There was a little gadget that allowed you to hack games. And I think at that point, it made me realize, there are different users. There's an admin user. And that just opened up of like, what are these privileges and power that that goes on in it? And so, and that was just incredible opportunity in that sense. And another dimension of that is my dad had a banner and sign shop in Chula Vista, California. Okay. And sometimes I would go in there just to help out and talk to him. And I think just that idea of being able to create something, being able to not only design something, talk with a customer on what they wanted, what their vision was, and then use plotters and equipment and computers. Corel Draw at that time was what I was using, right? Wow. But to use something, the fact that you can make something and just have an idea and turn it into a reality, into a tangible thing, it was incredible for me. And I think that's why I really got interested in computers and just the power of computers. And so there would be one time where someone came in and they wanted something, and my dad was out of town, and I said, yes, let me try this out. And I just started creating a banner and sign for some folks. And so I love the idea that computers can be used to create things and design things. And so that, in a way, that kind of just gave me a different perspective or a vision. Now I don't look at menus at restaurants the same. I don't look at signs the same way. And it's thinking about, how did that start off? What was the vision? What was made for that, and then all the way up to installation. So that's initially how I started getting. Later on, I started working as a robotics engineer, and it was my first day on the job in electrical engineering. And also, I really was interested in robotics engineering, and that's when I learned that you can use code to interact with the world. That's when some of that code just became physical to me and tangible. And so I wasn't initially interested in computer science and solving problems that have already been solved. So give me all the prime numbers up to number 35. It was already something that was done, and it didn't really interest me. And so later on, I realized with robotics that I could be creative. I can use code to solve new problems and new challenges and things that I was really passionate and interested about. And so that's kind of like computer science. Initially, I didn't know what computer science was, right? And so that's kind of how I started with a very kind of hands-on approach. And then now with the Scratch Foundation, I initially worked with Mitch Resnick and Karen Brennan about 13 years ago. I worked as a researcher with Education Development Center, and Education Development Center is a research group out in Boston, in the New York City area, and they received MIT Media Lab received a grant to evaluate the use of the creative computing curriculum. And so I came in. The researchers were just asked, who knows coding? What is coding? Who can we leverage on our team? And it was just an incredible opportunity for me to join that team and kind of looking at the role of educators, looking how curriculum was enacted, some of the principles behind it, looking at seeing Scratch in different ways. And so that was a 3-4 year long project funded by the National Science Foundation. Later on, since then, I've been working on designing and implementing programs and working closely with educators. A lot of scaling the work, the things that I learned from Mitch and Karen. So I always give them a shout out for that. But but ever since, and so since then, had really excited to join the Scratch Foundation because it was not as an opportunity not just think about the products, but the designing the experiences as well. And so I was always interested in just the design features that went into Scratch, and then seeing how there's a strong reason behind that, and strong passion between the folks. And so a lot of my work now is in supporting educators in on their professional journey with Scratch or with creative learning, and engaging communities, an online community of young people and as creators. And so as a former scratcher myself, and as a former trainer, I love this role because that's just those voices in the room, and just a huge inspiration for the work now at the foundation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And for our listeners, I'm not sure if we would have any listeners who have never seen or used Scratch before, but could you maybe just talk a little bit about what is Scratch, and how has it impacted, in your mind, like how has it impacted education?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And I jumped right into it, right? But Scratch is a creative programming language, and it's the largest online coding community in the world for children and teens. And so Scratch and Scratch Junior are two products aimed at for young people to create interactive games, stories, animation, imagine something and then create it, share it with somebody else around the world that they may not even know, and get feedback on it, maybe get some love, learn how to be kind to each other with their comments and feedback. And so, to me, what I love with Scratch and Scratch Junior is that you can create something and just share it with somebody else, and then part of that is getting feedback from that. Talking about your work, which is a huge part of just being a creator. Some of my favorite subjects in school growing up were art, and I just loved the whole space of getting inspired from others, going into someone else's studio and learning from what they're doing, and realizing, oh, did you see how they use that paint and that color, or what is this pastels? Pastels blew me away when I was in high school, and so I think to me that's Scratch is it's a fancy set of pastel colors, right? But how you use them and how you get feedback on your artwork, how you talk about your projects, that's what I think is what's been incredible that Scratch online community provides. And so Scratch is free. I always forget to say that sometimes, and it will continue to be free. But Scratch Junior is also a great product for early grades as well. And so the Scratch Junior product and experience has been really thought about. What are little minds in grades 5 and 7? How do they think? What do they use? So you don't need a mouse for that. It's a downloadable app. So I'm just thinking about the affordances of grade bands. Scratch was initially funded by the National Science Foundation as well, and it specifically targets middle schools students in grades 7th and 8th, or really kind of 5 to 8. And I think part of that is just the identity. At that age, you're just developing identity of like, I can create, I can connect with others. And so we specifically target that audience. But it's used in colleges, universities, high schools. Sometimes high schoolers are like, oh, this looks too kiddie for me. And then they start making a project and like, oh my God, this is going to take a lot of work from you to do, right? So even though it looks very inviting, and it intentionally it's made to look like inviting and be able to tinker, it gets complicated really fast, right? So sometimes kids will want to come in and make some intense video game and realize, oh my God, it's a lot of work that goes into it. So I think part of it is also just seeing the value of how much work others put into their stuff is, I think, really important, to realize like, oh, like that user put in a lot of work on this project. It's good to see that, I think, as a young creator, as a young connector.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of things I love to pick up on that you mentioned. I think that right there is number one. Is a lot of students play video games today and don't understand how much coding goes in to just make your sprite move down the line, until you start coding your own, and you're like, exactly. Oh my gosh, my sprite moved 2 blocks. And it took that many pieces of code. Like how, and I really do. I agree with you. I think there is something in having kids actually experience what does it take to build some of these games that we know that they're playing today. That's one. The second one is I'm so glad that you mentioned the community. Because Scratch itself is a fantastic program. Again, it is free. I'm sure almost every teacher, if you haven't heard about it, you need to go hear about it, and you need to just go over and start playing it. But the community that it's created, the community website, I think is one of my favorite pieces of it. Because this ability that I can take things and share them with the community,
Mm-hmm.
I can get
Mm-hmm.
feedback on them. I'm not making something that is just for me in the classroom. I can upload it to the website, and there it is. And to me, that's a huge, huge piece of why we bring Scratch into the classroom. I want to talk a little bit about that you work very closely on the Scratch Ed's Creative Computing Curriculum Guide. And that guide provides ideas for K 12 educators for short and long term plans and embeds reflection throughout. Where do you see the future of computational fluency headed in K 12 education? And how is Scratch hoping to be a part of that future?
Yeah. And so first, you can go to scratch.mit.edu to create your account and begin your Scratch journey, right? And so the guide, the Creative Computing Curriculum Guide, is a shout out to Harvard's Graduate School of Education's Creative Computing Lab and Karen Brennan, who's done amazing work. And so at that time, and this was the research project that I mentioned earlier, Karen Brennan had worked on this guide and worked also on the Scratchhead website, that's now been archived. Um, and so we came in and we initially came in as kind of third party evaluators. And so this was kind of like, you get money from the government, here's your strings attached, right? You gotta make sure that you're spending that money correctly. But then as researchers, we realized MIT Media Lab doesn't need that. They don't need someone to kind of follow their budget lines and then see how they're spending money. They're very
Right.
competent and have a clear vision. What the team needed was someone to go out and see how that curriculum and those activities were being enacted. And so that was a lot of my work in interviewing educators and taking a look at their approach for using Scratch, particularly focused on design-based learning environments and perspectives where educators were using the guide to create and build in some of the passions that student and youth voice in that. And so that was a very important, I think, and so the curriculum, I think, in those activities is about, I think one of the key parts of that is the word guide. And to me, it's very important because it really is a guide and it exists to help you find what works best for your students. So it's not this is a step-by-step script, but it's really an opportunity to encourage educators to find a balance between structure and agency. And that was a big part of that research work is we can have one design-based learning environment where it's like, go do whatever you want, right? And that will require a certain set of scaffolding and differentiating. But teachers know their students best. They may need a little bit more structure in thinking about, okay, let's try this together. Let's share out. And it can also mean depending what ages and where their journey is at, or if they've had other design-based learning opportunities. So it may be the first design-based learning opportunity. It may be the first time you're asked to imagine, to be creative. And so you may need a little bit more additional support to think about how to bring in those ideas. And so that's why that guide is important, because students are not only learning how to code, but they're learning at some of the perspectives associated about what they're making. And so in design-based learning, you're not all the projects hopefully look the same at the end, but the projects, there's a little bit of me inside the project, and maybe there's a little bit of me that I deconstructed in that project. And so maybe I love skateboarding, and which I do. I grew up skateboarding, and so how a skateboard works and how you ollie with a skateboard or jump is a certain process for that. And so maybe you want to create a project where you study and look at the physics behind it and realize you're maybe not in, and you're not realizing that you're looking at the physics behind skateboarding, but you actually are with math, with Scratch. And so I think that's a lot of my role in working in that creative computing curriculum guide is in gathering all that data, feeding that back, sharing that back with the Scratch team, and particularly Mitch and Karen, and then saying like, this is what I'm seeing. And so the work for those next 3 years was developing a computational thinking framework, or some of the big ideas of Scratch, identifying examples of that. So interviewing students, I would turn on a screen capture, gather during my interview so I can see students. I wouldn't see their faces. I just wanted to hear their voice, and I would ask them to do think aloud, analyzing those tapes and recordings, and then thinking of what other opportunities or what are ways where educators can create more opportunities for creative learning. And that was a big part of that work. And so I think part of the other question was the future of computing in education. And so I think, and I've seen this even in STEM education, right, where we initially probably started off with content, with concepts, right? You just need to know the water cycle, right? And so then we started realizing, oh, there's much more. There's a practices associated with that, right? And so next generation science standards and other standards really kind of push that initiative. And to me, I think it's very similar, that it's about how those concepts connect to other parts of your work and interest. And so um, and so part of that is not just not just stopping at concepts and the practices, but really thinking about what are some of the perspectives that you develop as you engage with computing. And part of that, I think, the future for us at the Scratch Foundation is that all students have access to computational fluency, and that they see a value in computing for whatever it is they want to do. So if they want to explore art and music, I see a value, and I'm also able to navigate that. And so, like, whether it be hiring a developer to create my light show during my concert in the background, or whether it be what's an NFT, how do I involve this in art, right? So I think part of that is a fluency, and I think it's very similar to a literacy, right? It's not just reading and writing for the sake of reading and writing, but to be able to express yourself, to be able to connect with others. It's work that I think goes beyond just just beyond writing, beyond reading, and so that's a lot of how we see that future.
Hey folks, I hope you are enjoying this episode with Francisco. As we talk today about having students learn through coding and the ability for students to create and be engaged through game-based learning as well, I wanted to talk about our show sponsor, Quizalize.com. What makes Quizalize so unique is you can take any quiz, whether it be one you made or one you import through the over 1 million resources they have available to you, and with a few clicks of a button, turn that quiz into a gamified learning experience for your students. We know that gamified learning increases student engagement, which leads to increased attainment levels. You can display the gameplay on the screen in front of the class while students complete their game on their device. Or you can set up team mode where you can have up to 10 teams and 100 players competing at the same time, having fun and learning all at the same time. After hearing today's episode, you could even have students start to think about what game they might want to create in Scratch by playing different learning games through Quizalize. Remember, you can get a free 1-month premium subscription by going to bit.ly/shifting schools. That's bit.ly/shifting schools, all one word, all capital letters. That premium subscription unlocks even more ways for you to use Quizalize and gives you full access to all their games. Again, that is bit.ly/shifting schools, all one word, all capitalized. You can also find a direct link to that in our show notes below this episode. Thank you to Quizalize for being a sponsor of the Shifting Schools community. And with that, here's more from Francisco.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that there are links to both the Scratch website where you can go set up a free account. If you don't have one already, we'll make sure that's in the show notes. And we'll also make sure there's a link to the creative computing curriculum guide as well. One of the things you talked about, and I'd love to dig into this just a little bit, is you talked about this push and pull between structure and agency. And what does that look like to you? And what are some things maybe in the guide that teachers have to kind of play off of those two? How much structure do I set up versus how much agency I give kids? And are you seeing that idea of scaffolding at different grade levels, especially now with Scratch Junior? You kind of maybe talk about that kind of push and pull of structure versus agency?
Yeah, definitely. In the creative computing guide, there are certain activities, and each activity is really kind of follows an imagine, create, share, reflect cycle, where you're imagining something, and perhaps that thing that you're imagining, it's something that you identify with, and so within that, I can then turn into like, how can I recreate this or make this myself, either the remixing or my own ideas, and then being able to share that out and with others for feedback and getting and also reflecting on your experience. And so at each different point, I believe there's an opportunity for a structure and agency, right? So imagining, I've been in some schools where educators and tell me like, my students haven't had an opportunity to create, to be imaginative, to be curious, right? Because a lot of the curriculum is probably very step by step, and it's very a little bit structured, right? And so And so then sometimes that asking for that youth voice and that agency can be a lot. And so how do we provide more opportunities before this creative coding experience to kind of build into that? And I think the same thing goes for creating, whether it be a tutorial that you're using or whether it be just here's a stack of code and we're going to kind of analyze this versus a tutorial walk you a little bit more on the how to. Same thing for sharing. I was at a training last week and facilitating a training, and for educators, it was the first time where they were in a position of being critical friends to each other, sharing feedback on their Scratch project. And so I realized, how do we do that a bit more? So we'll do an activity where we open up the idea of remixing, where we open up the idea of giving feedback. We'll do some more of that feedback before and kind of structure that out. And so I think that's one thing. And I think what I've noted, what I've loved in that creative computing curriculum guide, and I've seen in others, is by structuring agencies. So one way in that I've seen it kind of approached is providing coding constraints versus design constraints. And so that could be, here are 10 blocks of code, do whatever it is you want, but then the coding constraint is there. And so I'm able to at least provide a little bit more support just on those 10 blocks. I can be strategic, and those are my milestone blocks before we move into the activity.
Sure.
Or it could be a design constraint, or like you just use an orange square and a purple circle. That's all of what I want you to use in your design, and you can use whatever code you want. And so that provides a little bit of like a slider, if you will, I think, between structure and agency. Maybe a slider is not the best metaphor, but I think how much, where those constraints set up with, I think, design and coding is kind of one opportunity where I've seen educators provide that structure and agency.
I love that. You've mentioned this a couple times. You've mentioned this idea of design-based learning environments. Can you tell us more about the research and can you kind of maybe walk listeners through why that research is important in K-12 education?
Yeah. To me, it's important because I think design-based learning involves creating or recreating something with a little bit of yourself in it. And so, and we encourage Scratchers to design projects and make projects with their own voice. And an example of that is the Scratch Cat has no name, right? And we do that because we want you to delete the Scratch Cat. We want you to delete them right away and then add your own sprite. And the team felt that if they gave it a name, you might be a little bit more attached to it, right? You're a little bit more attached with something. And so
I never noticed that before until you just said that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. I never thought about that.
And so, but everybody loves the Scratch Cat on the other end, right? And so it's like and that's why we didn't give him a name. That's why there's very little identity associated with the Scratch Cat. On the other end, Scratch, the name itself, comes from DJs and music that grew up in hip hop music that grew out of the Bronx, and being able to remix something, being able to participate in that culture through either lyrics, through either music, through dancing, multiple kind of opportunities for that. And so it pays homage to the scratching and the noise that you will make on a turntable. And so part of that is being able to do some of that recreating, thinking about what a remix looks like, what it means to build on the ideas of others. And so those are, I think, very strong principles to the design-based learning. And that's why we have a remix. We show you how many remixes you've done. I encourage Scratchers to share notes and credits and give shout outs to people when they use a resource, just as we do in writing, right? Give a shout out to something, to a video or an image that you may have used, or someone else on your team, or maybe even yourself. I used this code a long time ago. I created this code and now I'm reusing it for something else. So I think those are those design-based learning opportunities. And one of the ways that I've kind of checked for that in a classroom, or kind of put an eye out, is that if all the activities, Scratch projects, look the same at the end, and have 30 different Scratch projects, then that's seems like a missed opportunity for youth voice, right? And so that gives me that may have been a very structured kind of environment, right? So then going back to that strip, maybe how can we provide more agency in that piece?
I like that.
And so, I think it's other. And I think so that is going beyond just creating a project and really thinking about how, when I create a project, how will I have a little bit of myself in that project. And there's a group also at the Parent Institute. Shout out to them for the great work. They talk about like hands-on, minds-on, and you've seen that. I think you might have heard in other places where it's not just hands-on activities where we're making a project, but our minds are also on. We're also thinking about those choices, whether it be a design choice or an abstraction. Or it's a connection between the part. And so that's a lot of that work. We sometimes refer as to the 4 Ps of projects, passions, peers, and play. And so I'm looking for those 4 Ps. Those 4 Ps are kind of the design principles. And so as an educator is creating a learning environment, how can they use those 4 Ps of how will the scratchers or my users create projects that they're passionate about alongside peers or with peers or for peers, for friends, and then being able to iterate on those projects. And so that play is essential of like testing and debugging, experimenting, iterating, trying out new things. And so I'll also I'll also ask in spaces like, what did you try out a new block? And so if nobody tried out anything new, then that's also kind of like a missed opportunity for me. We should be able to like experiment with something new, whether it be like, it's an idea or it's a block or something else. And it's not the student's fault and the educator, just how do we kind of open up the activity a bit more with some more design-based learning.
Yeah. And I love that. Again, that idea that if I end up with 30 projects that all look the same, I might have been too structured and not enough agency. And to be thinking through that, I think, and not just when we're using programs like Scratch. To me, that's an educational philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
Whenever we're having kids design something, if I'm telling kids, hey, go and design something, I'm hoping to get 30 different designs. One of the things you kind of talked about, and I'd love for you to kind of make a connection if you can for me, about how in Scratch we're helping to promote students giving credits to others whose code they might take, to share some of your code and take some of your code. Can you talk about like the importance of starting that in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade? And if you become a coder today over on GitHub, how important is that as well? Yeah. Like that's part of the coding community, right?
Yeah, that's definitely it. And I think it's sometimes schools are very heavy on plagiarism, right? And so sometimes I've walked into schools where it's like that's a little tricky, and so sometimes that's something to struggle with or reconcile with students. And so there's an activity in the creative computing curriculum guide on a creature construction and creature creation where I believe in literacy. It's also the exquisite corpse. I think where you work on something and you pass it along, and when you pass it along, that drawing you create little notches so the next person can know when to start off, and then you do that, and then the next person, but you don't see what's happening before, and then at the end we kind of reveal what those creatures created. And so those creatures are creatures that we probably couldn't have created on our own with those ideas. And so I love that activity because it elicits the power of remixing, the power of being able to work alongside others. And so before we give credit, I think before we jump into like giving credit, I think the first part is like, how do I value remixing, right? And building off the ideas of others. And I think once I like to like introduce that notion of remixing and the power and how we can do that, then we move into like, okay, so how do we give credit to other ways? And so I've had the Google CS First curriculum. One of the things that they do in that is they get a little post-it, and you use it use that post-it on your monitor or your laptop monitor if you need help, and then you that way your peers can see like, oh, what do you need help with, not just your educator. And at the end you write a shout out to somebody who inspired you, and so I love that because it's also an opportunity to scaffold giving shout outs, to scaffold giving credit. The next piece on the front page of a project in Scratch is then we have the notes and credits section. And so all of the Scratch Cat projects give shout outs and they cite their work, whether it be graphic or design or music. And so we try to model that in Scratch Cat projects. And I think that's part of like what we encourage other Scratchers to do. And I think that we should be doing more of, right? And there's different kind of opportunities for that. But I think that a lot of that, I guess what I'm saying is, the Scratch Online community, as much as we push that, is one thing, but educators also have a community in their classroom, right? Schools also have a community. And so I just can't pretend that community doesn't matter. Like it matters. And so creating links between our daily kind of interactions and the people and our peers with kind of what that means online is a big part of that as well.
I love that. And before we go, I wanted to share with you, just so that you hear some of what Scratch has done. I've got 2 stories that I'd love to be able to share with you of just me using Scratch with students. One of them is when I was in Bangkok, when I was a tech coach in Bangkok, we had a 5th grade student who was totally disengaged, and kid was wicked smart. and to the point where he was always trying to break into the school servers. I mean, this kid was wicked, right? But like when it came to doing schoolwork, wouldn't engage. Like just found schoolwork boring. And at one point, I think he actually hacked one of the printers in our school. Anyway, so I end up getting this kid because he likes technology, and so I brought him in, and during their time he was acting out in class, he would come and see me, and I hooked him up with Scratch, and I was just like, look, sit over here at the table, and I know you already know a little bit of coding, but see what you can do with this. And I was like, this is a brand new program. I'm testing it out. Yes. Like I have my whole spiel with him. And so he would come, and like a half hour a day, he would just start building, right? He was just building stuff. And then at the end of the half hour, I'd say, show me what you built today. What did you go? How did it start? And then in class, they were starting to do an environmental sustainability unit. And so his project, instead of creating a poster or a presentation like the rest of the students, he decided that he wanted to create something in Scratch. And so here's a kid who was totally not engaged, spent hours of time with me, and of course, I'm learning Scratch right along with him at this point, and I mean, surpassed my knowledge of Scratch within a couple of days together. But he was working on it at home. He ends up creating an environmental sustainability game where his little sprite would run around like the four corners of his board, and he had to be able to like cut the trees down because if the trees grow too much, the forest overtook everything. And then he had to go and he had to feed I think he had pigs or cattle or something, cows, and he had to feed the cows, but he couldn't feed them too much because then they would overpopulate. Wow. And so he had the four corners. I don't remember what the other two corners are, but one was like deforestation, one was meat resources, and I forget what the other two resources. But your little sprite had to run around and keep your environment in control, otherwise it got out of control. And as you went up every level, of course, things grew faster and died faster, and so you had to constantly be going faster and faster and faster. And he got to allow the kids in the class got to play his game. And it was like a shining moment for this kid who was the little geek in the back of the room that kept getting in trouble, and all of a sudden he's got the cool game that he's teaching about environmental sustainability.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah, it was so good, man. That kid, I was just
that's
like,
good.
Wow, and
I'm sure there was some. I know, and I'm sure there was some math, right? Like some math creeped up in there, and
for sure.
And that's what's awesome about like those activities as well. Is like that perspective and that change of like I can create, I can hack things and I can make them, but then I can also create something, right? And being able to share that with others and my ideas. I love that example, and I always use, and when I train educators and math creeps up, I always like yell out, "You're like, oh my god, it's our friend Math," know, like to really call that out because it contextualizes a lot of that.
For sure.
I also love that he was able to share that with others, and because it's really tricky, like as an artist, like sharing works. Ask a teacher to share a lesson plan, and it gets very personal real quick, right?
Exactly.
And so, and I think that's part of. What it's also, you may have other ideas of what they're doing next. But I think being able to share a work in progress or even a specific point is super important. So it's awesome to be able to provide the opportunity. I'm curious, how did you grade that? How did you evaluate that? Because it sounds like other folks were working posters or kind of other things.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a new medium. How did you do that?
It was great. Well, the teacher had a rubric. And so we were able to, because she was, with whatever the other kids decided to do. Like their agency was, you get to decide. But of course, the teacher didn't know Scratch existed. So it wasn't one of the things you could decide from. You could be a poster, a PowerPoint presentation, or you could make a video. And so when it came time to grade it, it was literally having a conversation with him and saying, talk about this part of environmental sustainability. Yeah. Talk about this part. And it was literally just talking with him to understand he knew all of it. He knew way more than, he had to in order to create the game the way that the game was created about how do we keep our environment stable, was a huge part of it. And so that's how we graded it. It was just actually having a conversation with him.
That's awesome.
And talking about what did you learn and what did you see. I mean, of course, the rubric couldn't even hold everything that this kid had learned in that. The other story I wanted to tell you, and I think this is an interesting one as well. I was a substitute teacher when we moved back here to the States for a while, and I went and I was substituting in a third grade classroom that had very few computers. Like the school itself just had a set of iPads in a cart that didn't connect to the internet. So when I would go into substitute, I would bring every device I had. I had old iPads and I don't know, Android tablets, whatever. And I would load different games for kids to play.
Okay.
And one of the games I would load would be Scratch Junior for these third graders. And
perfect.
throughout the day, as I was a substitute teacher, kids could go and play the game because it was a great way for a substitute teacher, by the way, to allow that stuff to happen.
Yeah.
But watching a third grader, the joy in a third grader's eyes, the first time they get their sprite to move forward. Like these kids, they didn't have a curriculum. I didn't teach them anything. I'm just like, here's a game. Go and start dropping blocks. This is all you do. Drag and drop blocks.
That's great.
And to see a third grader, like, I made my sprite move forward and then he went right and he picked up something. It was just like mind-blowing to these kids. And I think there's so much possibility there with just this. You as an educator, you don't need to know all the time how it works. And that's one thing I love about the computing curriculum guide that we will have in the show notes, is it helps get you started in just see what the kids can create. Get started by having kids create something on their own and then decide, okay, where could I fit this in my curriculum? Right. But that idea of designing something that is yours, I think is so powerful.
Thanks for calling that out. I mean, that's so important. There's usually there's a certain level of comfort, right? And I think part of I love your experience, and also in saying like I don't have this experience, and also being just honest and being within 2 days, a student can gain much more experience with coding, but I think you're still coming in with your great experience in facilitating those environments, right? Like setting that up was incredible, and then setting and realizing like, oh, we're learning together. If not, you're learning more. I think that the power of what I think that does in changing the relationship between what a student sees you as a teacher, right, is like now we're both learning together in this piece, and it's just not you telling someone else that you know everything, and it expresses the notion of being resourceful, this resource of like I can do it, and then also I can ask questions about the world, I think, and make sense of them through computing. It's extremely powerful, and so and I just say that because I get asked a lot, how much do I need to know about Scratch to work, to do a Scratch unit or a Scratch activity? And so part of that is it's where your comfort level is, right? And being able to elicit those that thinking from other Scratchers, other students is important. And I think good instruction is just good instruction, right? In any kind of space, whether it be coding, math, or literacy. And so, I guess, you may have said you didn't know as much as Scratch, but you did know how to set up a great learning environment, right? And I think that's what's super important, and that educators should be leveraging and are always leveraging.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Francisco, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate it. Again, if I know many of you out there listening to this have heard of Scratch. Maybe you forgot about Scratch because it's been around for so long. Scratch.mit.edu. I can go your free account, get started. It's all free. It will always be free, which I appreciate the MIT picking up Scratch. That's a whole nother episode about the evolution of Scratch that we could go into. That's been so fascinating to follow through my own education career as well. And we'll also make sure down there in the show notes, the Scratch Ed's Creative Computing Curriculum Guide to help get you started will be in the show notes as well. Thanks so much, Francisco. As we get ready to sign off, if people want to reach out to you or to the team or are looking for further support, where is a good place for educators to go?
Yeah, and so you talked a little about that evolution and of Scratch, and so now Scratch is its own foundation. We're still located out in Boston, but I think you can find us at scratchfoundation.org, and then sign up for our newsletter. We offer our Scratch conference and Scratch Day throughout the year, but connect with us via scratchfoundation.org and check us out there as well.
Awesome, and we'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. Francisco, thank you so much. Appreciate your time, and then until next time, we'll see you on the network.
Okay. Thanks, Sergio.